what the quotas are for what countries, when they're adding oil back. It is 3 times more complicated than the dot plot. I'm not at all kidding you. Saleh, do you agree with me? I mean, it's so confusing as to understand what OPEC Plus is doing that I don't blame the oil price for being confusing either.
No, I totally agree. I think the current outlook for the oil market and oil prices is that we do have abundant supply for now, and the demand picture is still quite bleak, especially for the second half of this year. And when you look at what OPEC Plus is trying to do, I mean, they currently have 3 layers of output cuts, and this is pretty confusing for OPEC watchers like myself as well. And what they told the market at their last meeting on June the 3rd was that the first 2 layers, they are holding on to those cuts until the end of last year. But the 3rd layer, which was just voluntary output cuts by only 8 member nations from OPEC Plus, they will extend them until the end of the 3rd quarter, but starting in the 4th quarter, they will start to unwind them. And the market actually didn't like this at all, which tells me, once again, that what the market is seeing is plenty of supply, even in the 4th quarter of this year, and the demand outlook that's still pretty soft. I mean, I don't think demand has necessarily been bad this year, but it also hasn't been that great. And when you look at some of the expectations for the 3rd quarter, for the 4th quarter, is that it really picks up in the 3rd quarter. I mean, seasonally, this is generally a good quarter, but there's a significant increase in demand expectations. And the market seems to think, I mean, the market seems not so confident about that increase in demand. So all in all, I think it's a very complicated structure that OPEC Plus has with these cuts now, and they are in a difficult position now where any increase in demand may actually be met by increase in supply by producers outside of the OPEC Plus group. So there seems to be very little room for them to increase supply in the rest of this year. So what I expect is that they just extend all the output cuts they have to the end of this year, ease that our market anxiety, and the 2025 outlook will still count on demand being strong, which is not really a given.
So, Saleh, I guess when we talk about demand, one of the wild cards I always think about is China. What's the market discounting today in terms of demand from China?
Yeah, that's a big question mark. And, you know, as you say, China growth has been one of the biggest drivers of oil demand growth as well. And I think we could be looking at a change in paradigm where, you know, I think the market may have been assuming a 6% growth for China, where maybe we need to be pricing in a 4% growth in China. And it's still unclear what that would mean exactly for how that would translate into oil demand growth numbers from China. But I think a lot of the anxiety we're seeing right now for expectations of oil demand in the second half of the year is still being driven by China, because we still don't know where China goes from here in the 3rd quarter and 4th quarter.
And that's sort of the problem. Like, nobody knows where demand is going to go. Like, it's going to eventually decrease, but it's not going to zero. And it feels like, as you were just saying, therein lies OPEC Plus's problem. At the same time, the supply side here in the US and Canada, Brazil, Guyana, it's really, really holding up. And all this M&A in the US is only going to make these guys even more efficient, AKA get more oil out of rocks, for example. What do we make of that part of the equation?
No, I totally agree with you. And I think the dilemma for OPEC Plus right now is clearly their strategy has been focusing on supporting prices and foregoing market share for now, because, you know, they need higher oil prices to fiscally break even back home. But the dilemma is that the higher they keep prices for their transformation projects back home, or whatever it might be, for the fiscal break-even prices, but at the same time, the higher they keep prices, the more they encourage non-OPEC Plus. I mean, as you said, the US shale, Brazil, Guyana, pretty soon Namibia. So they're at this point where, you know, they want higher oil prices, but the higher they artificially keep oil prices, the more they're encouraging non-OPEC Plus supply, which in turn makes it very difficult for them to start tapering those cuts. So it's a very difficult position for them, I think. And on your, very briefly, on your point on demand, again, I absolutely agree. I mean, as long as I've been covering the oil space, I've never seen a bigger divergence in oil demand expectations between different agencies. When you look at OPEC Plus,
Yeah.
what they tell us for this year is that they expect the growth in oil demand globally to be 2.2 million barrels per day. What IEA is telling us is about half of that. And you know, when we talk about 2030, 2035, it's pretty common that we see divergence in expectations between OPEC and IEA. But for this year, to have such a big divergence is something that I've never seen before. So clearly, no one really knows what happens in the second half of the year. As I said, third quarter, you know, an uptick is likely. This is a seasonally good period for oil demand. But then what happens in China and what happens in the fourth quarter globally, we really don't know.
See, I told you, Paul. I told Paul, I was like, look, you don't have to know anything about oil right now because no one knows what's happening with oil. So you're good. You're in good company.
So, Salih, how about supply from our good friends in Texas and Oklahoma? Where's the U.S. in terms of global supply these days? How does the market discount that?
So, I mean, as we've discussed on this call before as well, last year, I think the U.S. supply growth surprised all of us. I mean, many of the analysts on the street, including myself, we didn't really see that growth from the U.S. coming because, you know, we've been talking about how a lot of these producers, a lot of these companies are very much prioritizing shareholder returns. You know, CapEx levels are not expected to be at pre-pandemic levels just yet. And even with those, we saw incredible growth in U.S. output. This year, I mean, what we're hearing and what we expect in BI is probably not as much growth as we saw last year. But again, I mean, oil price levels have been very favorable for these producers. So they've been able to deliver those shareholder returns, but at the same time, increase CapEx that's going into their current projects, as well as some of their growth projects as well. So I can't give you a number, but a number that's probably slightly lower than the number we saw last year, which was about 1 million barrels per day. Which again, I mean, it may not be as big as the number last year, but I think it's still a big enough number to give OPEC Plus trouble.
All right. Salih, thank you very much. Salih Yilmaz, we really appreciate it. Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Technology Analyst joining from Dubai. It is very much a confusing market for sure, looking at sort of oil all over the place this year so far. Talk about all over the place, that is not the equity market, doing a whole lot of nothing. The NASDAQ up by about 0.3%. Happy Thursday. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio.
company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, I'm Lisa Mateo. Broadcom on track for its biggest gain in 4 years after its latest earnings. It also announced a 10-for-1 stock split, and that has shares up about 13%. We get more tech earnings later today from Adobe. And Apple shares, they're up about 0.5%. And this is after it's flirting with Microsoft as the most valuable company in the world. Bloomberg's Jess Menton says the iPhone maker has an incredible run since the early days of COVID.
Over this stretch, Apple has added nearly $400 billion in market cap. That's larger than the current market cap of 480 companies in the index.
Now, some news from Alphabet's Google. It's agreed to buy clean power from Warren Buffett's NV Energy and thermal energy startup, and that's to run data centers on electricity that comes from the Earth's own heat. We have Alphabet shares. They're down about 0.7%. And sticking with tech, Bloomberg reporting OpenAI is on pace for $3.4 billion of annual revenue. And just ahead of its shareholder meeting today, Tesla CEO Elon Musk says 2 key shareholder votes, well, they're passing by wide margins. One, to reaffirm his $56 billion pay package, and the other to move the company's home to Texas. Bloomberg's Craig Trudell says it's something to Tesla bulls that they were worried about.
If Musk was not able to get approval for this compensation, concerns about him, taking his eye off the ball and potentially, devoting more time and resources to his other ventures, and he has many other, as we know, whether it's X or XAI.
And we have Tesla shares up more than 3%. To entertainment now, where the Wall Street Journal reporting Sony Pictures has acquired dine-in theater chain Alamo Drafthouse Cinema. And finally, the New York Times says Disney and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has reached an agreement, and that locks in a 15-year expansion plan for Disney. I'm Lisa Mateo.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, happy Thursday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the news in business and finance with our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts that cover 2,000 companies and 140 industries around the world. We also keep you updated on world and national news, and for that, we go to Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Lisa, the Supreme Court has reserved full access to mifepristone. That's the pill used in more than half the abortions in this country. In a unanimous ruling, the justices overturned a federal appeals ruling that would have barred mail-order prescriptions for the drug. But Bloomberg's June Grasso says the justices did not weigh in on the FDA's looser restrictions around the pill.
They're not talking about mifepristone. They're not talking about abortion. What they're talking about is standing, which is a procedural thing, really. And it's a way sometimes for them to get out of cases, out of deciding the merits of the case by looking at the procedural elements.
Bloomberg law host June Grasso. Donald Trump is making a return to Capitol Hill to meet with House and Senate Republicans. This is despite the federal charges against Trump for conspiring to overturn the 2020 election and his recent guilty verdict in an unrelated hush money trial. He is having a closed-door morning meeting with House Republicans, and then he will meet privately with Senate Republicans, both at campaign headquarters near the Capitol, to discuss party priorities. It is his first as the party's presumptive nominee. The refrain remains the same. Keep giving for as long as it takes. That's Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin's message to his NATO counterparts at a meeting in Brussels. While billions have already gone to Kyiv, Austin insists billions more need to be donated to the cause.
The stakes of this war are high, and Ukraine's survival is on the line, but so is all of our security. None of us would want to live in a world where Putin prevails.
But the recent EU election results show a widening gap between European leaders expressing this view and the mood of average citizens who are growing tired of footing the bill. The summit of the G7 nations has opened in Italy. Negotiators reached agreement hours before the official opening of the summit on a U.S. proposal to back a $50 billion loan to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets as collateral. Round one of the U.S. Open underway at Pinehurst. Brooks Koepka is in a three-way tie for the lead at 3 under. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, and Charlie.
All right. Thank you so much, Michael Barr. Really appreciate it. So I never interned when I was a kid because I got to work. I got to make money.
Yep.
So
Me
I worked
too,
in restaurants, all those kind of things. But apparently a lot of people do this internship thing. And there's not that many jobs anymore. So this comes from Handshake, which is a job searching platform for college students. Apparently the total number of internships listed fell more than 7% from last June through May versus the same period a year earlier. And the average number of applicants that each internship drew jumped to 93 from 53 the previous year.
Yeah, so I'm looking at some of the industries where we're seeing this most pronounced. Professional services down 16% year over year. Nonprofit down 15%. Technology down 14%. That's surprising. And then financial services down 13%. And the tougher road for internship seekers reflects companies' move to temper entry-level hiring. That's especially true in fields like finance, consulting, and tech, which have cooled dramatically amid some industry-wide layoffs there.
I guess I didn't think about it this way, but Julia Pollack, who's a chief economist over at ZipRecruiter, says that internships are actually really expensive. Like you have to use part of your HR team to oversee them and to help make it fun, etc. You have to pay them, not necessarily get great quality work out of them. I didn't know you paid internships. This is what I know. Yeah. So it's not as productive maybe as you would think. So I think that's pretty interesting as well. Is it's just a belt tightening kind of scenario?
Right. Well, it's important though for like when I was managing Bloomberg Intelligence, our internship was a nice pipeline for our entry level.
Right. Interesting. Maybe they just don't want / need that anymore. I don't know. I think everyone should just like go and hustle some money.
Exactly.
Scoop some ice cream.
I was a busboy. I pumped gas.
I was a bus girl. I was a waitress. I was a hostess.
Really?
I could balance 3 plates on one hand.
I can't do that.
Yeah, that was my one claim to fame. All right, coming up, we're going to take you back to D.C. and the Supreme Court case on the SCOTUS ruling on mifepristone. We're going to have more details on that.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are two big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to get the latest reporting on that Supreme Court ruling on the abortion pill. That'll be coming up in just moments. We're also going to check in with Emery Horton. She is in Italy at the G7 meeting, get the latest reporting from there as well. And then Oscar DeBach, CEO of DHL Supply Chain. We're talking supply chains and shipping and all that kind of stuff. I think during the pandemic, we all became kind of quasi-experts in supply chain management. So we'll get the latest on kind of where we are with the global supply chain and shipping. But right now, let's go to Mr. Charlie Pellet for a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. And here's what's going on. We are looking at a decidedly mixed market right now with the Dow, the S&P, they are in the red. NASDAQ advancing 26 points now, up by about 0.1%. We've got the S&P lower by 8, down 0.2. The Dow retreating by 0.7%. So stocks, at least the S&P, pulling back from yesterday's record. NASDAQ, though, keeps on going, as I mentioned, up by 0.1%. 10-year, 4.27%, with a 2-year that's now yielding 4.70%. Gold down $9 the ounce, down 0.4%. West Texas Intermediate crude up 0.1%. 78.56 for a barrel of WTI. So what about the outlook for U.S. equity trading over the summer, given the more than 13% gain this year for the S&P 500 index? Phil Orlando is chief equity strategist at Federated Hermes, and he was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
If we do get some chop over the summer, which is our forecast, that there will be this broadening out of the rally, there will be this reversion to the mean, and I think playing defense for the next quarter or two, at least going into the election, isn't a bad strategy.
The U.S. Supreme Court has sided with Starbucks over the National Labor Relations Board in a decision that will make it more difficult for the agency to win temporary reinstatement of workers fired during labor disputes. Speaking of which, Wells Fargo fired more than a dozen employees last month after investigating claims that they were faking work. The staffers, all in the firm's wealth and investment management unit, were, quote, discharged after a review of allegations involving simulation of keyboard activity, creating impression of active work. Recapping stocks lower, S&P down 10, drop there of 0.2%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
How does that work?
No, I don't
like
know.
you just like, are you watching TV or something and you're just like typing keyboards and then that simulates work? I don't know. That was pretty funny. That may be my favorite story of the whole day.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We bring you all the top news in business and finance and the world through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. We want to take you back to that landmark Supreme Court ruling. The court is keeping full access to a widely used abortion pill called mifepristone. The court unanimously overturned a federal appeals ruling that would have barred mail-order prescriptions for mifepristone, that drug used now in more than half of U.S. abortions. We want to get more on this with Greg Storr, Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. Greg, walk us through some of the details.
Yeah, so this is a widely used abortion pill used in more than half the abortions in the U.S. now. And the two lower courts had put restrictions on it. At one point, it looked like the drug might even be taken off the market. But as it came to the Supreme Court, a federal appeals court had rolled back some changes that had been put in place by the Obama and Biden administrations that made the drug easier to get, including by mail. And the Supreme Court today overturned that ruling and said the people challenging it, these anti-abortion doctors and organizations, didn't have a right to go into court to challenge these things. They weren't being harmed by the expansion of mifepristone access, and so therefore they couldn't sue.
Greg, given the makeup of this Supreme Court, was this ruling a surprise?
It's not based on the arguments, and do keep in mind that this is essentially, it's a very important procedural issue, but it's a procedural issue that the Supreme Court ruled on. They didn't rule on the right to abortion. They didn't even rule on whether the FDA had the authority to do what it did when it expanded access to mifepristone. All it said is, hey, these are the courts aren't the forum for this particular dispute, and they left open the possibility that maybe there's somebody else out there who could sue to challenge it. In which case we'll have this conversation again at a later point.
And what else is on the docket for the Supreme Court around abortion?
There is another case involving abortions in emergency rooms in states that have really strict bans. The case involving Idaho, and the question is whether a federal hospital law that requires emergency rooms to provide stabilizing care, whether that law lets doctors in Idaho perform abortions in cases of medical emergencies where they might not otherwise have been allowed to perform them under Idaho's law. So that's another significant abortion case we're going to get in the next couple of weeks.
All right, Greg Storr, thank you so much. We appreciate that reporting. Greg Storr, Bloomberg Supreme Court reporter. Again, the news, Supreme Court backs full access to widely used abortion pill, and we'll keep on top of that story. Another story that is brewing in Puglia, Italy, is the G7 is meeting there, and I didn't know where Puglia was, so I had to Google map it. It's sitting right on the Adriatic Sea.
It's not too shabby.
That's not too shabby.
Yeah.
So somebody had to go, so we sent Anne-Marie Hordern. She's chief political correspondent, and she's also the anchor of Bloomberg Surveillance. Anne-Marie, can you give us a sense of what the agenda was for the G7 meeting for these leaders, and kind of what we're seeing in terms of getting something done?
Well, the main takeaway, and this was part of the reporting I had early this morning, was that they were able to get through an agreement when it comes to tapping the use of the immobilized, frozen Russian assets, $280 billion worth, that are basically sitting in Europe. The Europeans were on board and signed off on giving the interest that these securities are accruing over the course of the year to Ukraine, but that's only about $3 to $6 billion worth. The United States has been pushing for months to try to front load that money, to give a bigger loan to Ukraine up front, and then just get paid back from those assets down the line. And they were able to get this over the finish line, although it was definitely tense. Negotiators were working really to the very last minute on this, and even some of the technical details regarding this agreement and plan will be dealt with after the G7. But Ukraine is now expecting $50 billion worth from these countries led by the United States before the end of the year. And why this is so important is, one, it really election-proofs the fact that Ukraine might not be waiting for more funds. They now will have $50 billion before the end of the year, and many officials will tell you they're in dire need of this financial assistance. And it doesn't matter potentially who will be the president of the United States, who could be the prime minister in the United Kingdom, which they have an election in 3 weeks' time. You have a lot of leaders showing up here who are almost lame ducks. They're weakened at home, coming to the G7 table, but they're able to act now for potentially Ukraine's future.
That's such a good point and a good distinction, removing that election risk. What is next on the docket? How does this unfold over the next 24 hours?
Really, the standout for today is going to be later this evening when President Biden holds a press conference with Volodymyr Zelensky, and it comes after they sign a bilateral security agreement. It'll last about 10 years. This is another deliverable that potentially the Biden administration is trying to election-proof. It's not a treaty, so a future U.S. president could pull the United States out of it, but it is an agreement that would mean more cooperation between the United States and Ukraine. It also comes as the president has decided to send another Patriot missile battery over to Ukraine. So he wants to make a statement here at the G7 that the United States continues to support Ukraine, and he wants it to be one of unanimity amongst other world leaders. Again, the problem with a lot of these world leaders, barring Giorgia Meloni, the Italian prime minister, is that they really are coming to this G7 weekend with a more fickle electorate that they have not really received mandates from. If you look at the European parliamentary elections, Emmanuel Macron had to come out and talk about the fact that he's not going to resign. Rishi Sunak has an election in 3 weeks. Trudeau is facing serious opposition and terrible polls, as well as Olaf Scholz.
Wow. Yeah, that was an interesting visual to see the photograph of the G7 leaders, who's going to be there, who's not. Anne-Marie Hordern, thank you so much for your reporting. We really appreciate it. Anne-Marie Hordern, chief political correspondent and anchor of Bloomberg surveillance reporting from Puglia, Italy, right on the Adriatic Sea. It looks absolutely beautiful. Good place to have a conference there. Let's switch gears here and talk about supply chains. Again, I think we all became somewhat expert in supply chain analysis during the pandemic because, boy, did that take a big shock. And the question is kind of where are we now in a post-pandemic world? Oscar de Bach joins us. He's the CEO of DHL Supply Chain. He's joining us remotely from our Amsterdam bureau. I haven't even been to our Amsterdam bureau, but I'm sure it's spectacular like every other bureau we have. Oscar, thanks so much for joining us here. I'd love to get your perspective as you think about the global supply chain from your perspective. Where are we in terms of getting back to, I'm going to say, normal? I'm not sure if that's the right word, but where are we in terms of moving goods around the world?
Yeah, no, really good to be here, and indeed the view of your Amsterdam studio is really good. Actually, it's not Puglia, but still it's decent. So back to your question. Yeah, what is normal is obviously the question. But what you do see is if you take the last 4 years, where we've seen obviously every distraction and disruption of supply chains over time, being at wars and being as obviously the disease and all of that. But where I think we are now is starting to get in a phase where it gradually starts to stabilize. But it's also because companies have become far better, and people as well, obviously consumers as well, but the companies have become far better to respond to the unexpected. And I think that's also one of the elements on how supply chains are now managed far better than at the time. Sort of companies moved away from the just-in-time part to now making sure that products are actually available. There's far more security in supply chains, but also there's better use of data. There's better, so the whole digitalization is better. Yeah. And indeed, supply chains are organized differently. If you look at where stocks are being put, how it's being spread over the world, whether you call it nearshoring, omnishoring, China plus one, all of that. But you see a change of how supply chains are organized.
Well, and then to that point, I mean, I was going to go with logistics and robots, not future crazy, weird looking robots, but just the idea that companies had to become much leaner and get better and trim lots of fat and be better at logistics to do all the things that you're talking about. That's also an investment cycle. Where are we in that right now in the industry?
So what you see is that indeed the industry has really accelerated in that perspective. So if you take if you take the robotics element of it, and indeed it's not a futuristic thing, it's actually happening today, where lots of operations, fulfillment operations work with collaborative robotics, where people work together with robots, with robotic solutions, and that's one way which is important not only from a productivity perspective, but also to be able to manage and to cope with fluctuations of seasonalities, of high seasons, peak seasons. And you see that if I take our own company as an example, where maybe 5 years ago we would have 0 robots, we now have about 7,000, and that is fast growing further. And that helps us to better manage the unexpected, but also better manage peak seasons, and also to make a working environment more exciting for people as well, because that's the other element. You need to make sure to be able to attract people, to be a great place to work for people. So that's another important element on that robotics agenda as well. But that always comes together with being better at data analytics, because the better you can read data, the better you can forecast, make the right investments, but also forecast what's going to happen tomorrow, next week, and the week after.
Oscar, one of the themes that came out of the pandemic was a sense of we got to shore up our supply chain. So that means, I guess, onshoring, friend-shoring, maybe bringing stuff a little bit closer to the end market. Are we actually seeing that? Do you actually see that in trade flows?
Yeah, what you see is and you already said it right? There's several names that has been given to it, whether it's now nearshoring, onshoring, omnishoring, and then you have the China Plus One terminology. But what it all comes back to is that, yes, there is an element of having stock closer to the end market, but there's a more important element is that companies don't bet anymore to have their key supplies, their key components coming from one sourcing point on one continent. They all make sure that whenever they now make investments in their next capacity, so their next production site and their next part, they make sure that it is on a different continent. And that's what you start to see. You see that very much in the semicon business, right, where you see lots of investments in Malaysia, investments in the US, investments in the eastern parts of Europe. So that's a trend you see. Or if you look at the automotive industry, the major investments that you see in Mexico there, but similarly also in for instance, in Thailand, in India. So you see that the supply chains are being spread moreover to actually spread the risk and indeed at the same time also be closer to the market.
Before we let you go, you talked about how suppliers are looking for the not just in time, but to build a little bit of inventory, which leads me to demand. Where are the weak parts right now?
The weak parts in the supply chains, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, like in terms of the demand pull, like what kind of countries are buying? Like what kind of industries still have that demand pull?
Well, I think overall, it's not that there's... so what you see is that the demand pool overall, because I was just in a different interview, we were just discussing about the volumes that are upcoming. And what you clearly see at the moment is that stocks are being built up, not to the levels maybe that we've seen 2 years back, but companies are building up stock because they are forecasting a certain demand pool in Q3, Q4. Now, how much that actually is going to be, that we now need to see. Your question about from a geography perspective, there's obviously we see an increased flow from Asia to the US to Europe. We see an hesitant increase of building up of stock in the US. A similar picture in some parts of Europe. So that's a bit from a geographical perspective how you see that. But overall, there is a sort of a careful building up of stock being ready for a sort of conservative peak season.
All right, Oscar, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate getting your first-hand insight. Oscar de Bach, he's the CEO of DHL supply chain. Joining us from our Amsterdam bureau, which, again, for those on YouTube, looks pretty darn sweet. So I'm looking at WTI crude oil here. I mean, I'm surprised, given what we just heard, from some of these players out there, that it's not lower than it is.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like, but I guess it's just uncertainty as to where demand is going to be.
Yeah, and then I think the crude picture is just really cloudy because there's also the supply picture, but overall, we're definitely looking at a risk-off market. But I think that the culprit right now, guys, is definitely over in Europe. The concerns that Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party is going to move into looser fiscal policy if it wins the upcoming legislative election. That's sort of dominating the markets over there, dragging down equities here, as well as a bid into the bond market.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All day long at Bloomberg, a rally in U.S. stocks fizzling after yesterday's surge for the S&P, a record yesterday. Right now, 54.12 on the S&P, down 8, drop there of just about 0.2%. Dow Jones Industrial Average down 261 points, a decline right now of 0.7%. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index up 16, For NASDAQ, that is a gain of just about 0.1%. After yesterday's surge, a retreat for the Russell 2000 index, small cap shares down now by 1.3%, 10-year 4.27%, the 2-year 4.70%. Gold down 0.7%, West Texas Intermediate down 0.2%. Broadcom shares surging after earnings, up now by 13.1%. Broadcom is a chip supplier for Apple. It is seeing its biggest surge in 4 years after its latest results topped estimates. Also announcing a 10-for-1 stock split following NVIDIA. NVIDIA shares up today, another record there, up another 2.3%. And briefly, Adobe will be among some of the names reporting after the close of trading, along with RH, the old restoration hardware. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube as well. So head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Podcast, and that's where you'll find us. Well, a significant story that we're following today, of course, is the U.S. Supreme Court preserved full access to a widely used abortion pill in a case that carried major stakes for reproductive rights and election year results. The court unanimously overturned a federal appeals that would have barred mail-order prescriptions of mifepristone, the drug now used in more than half of U.S. abortions. Let's get some color on that. We do that with Wendy Schiller. Wendy is the professor at Brown University. Wendy, what do you make of this decision coming out of this Supreme Court here in what is an election year?
Yeah, hi, Paul. I mean, it's an interesting decision. They really use the idea of standing. They basically said, you know, the people who are suing are not injured or directly impacted by this, by the FDA's power to approve this called abortion pill, but that's the moniker for it. And so they really stuck to jurisdiction. Like you don't have standing to bring this case to us. The Fifth Circuit, you know, upheld the plaintiff's request, but also in their opinion said, well, we're not sure this is going to hold up at the Supreme Court. None of the plaintiffs are directly injured. And that's the way the Supreme Court unanimously got out of sort of the bigger debate about this pill and abortion. It is used in the majority of medical abortions in this country. So the politics are that the Republicans can breathe a sigh of relief because the Democrats cannot make this another issue on top of abortion access. But on the other hand, pro-life groups will now push Republicans on the campaign trail to say they'll do something legislatively about this rather than through the courts.
What could they do legislatively then? What would be on the docket for that?
Well, Alex, they could do a few different things. One is they could limit the jurisdiction of the FDA. They could, you know, try to reverse the supremacy clause, which is that the federal law supersedes state law. Louisiana, for example, has now scheduled this particular pill as a dangerous substance, which really limits its access. That's going to happen in more states. The question is, can the federal government undo that or contradict that? So they could push for laws that say in this particular case, the FDA overreaches and Congress is not giving the FDA this power. I think it's unlikely that the Congress will do that for lots of reasons having to do with drug development and access, but it could be something that some Republicans bring up on the campaign trail, but it will only sort of fire up people who are really concerned about abortion access, who showed their electoral might in 2022 and are expected to get out the door again in 24.
So I guess, Wendy, how do you think each campaign will maybe approach this issue here? I mean, are they just going to say, you know, the Supreme Court is ruling, will continue to rule, and will abide by that? I mean, how is this ruling today, do you think, will impact 24?
Well, Paul and Alex, I think the Biden administration will take credit for having an FDA, and some of these decisions predate the Biden administration, but protecting the FDA's discretion and FDA as a medical institution. And they'll say, listen, if you want to make sure that your access not just to this drug, but to lots of other drugs that might help you or save your life, you have to go with us because we're the ones who believe in science. That will be the Biden message. Trump will be quiet about this. He has tried to back away from abortion, really saying leaving it to the states rather than going for some national ban, because he recognizes that of all the issues that could deny him a victory, abortion is very high on the list, especially in states like at least Arizona for now, and possibly also on the ballot in Florida.
So there is another abortion case before the Supreme Court. Can you walk us through what that is and how it differs?
Well, I mean, the other thing is about whether emergency room doctors and hospitals have to provide abortion to save the life of somebody. In other words, to make the case that even in a state that doesn't allow abortion in case of danger to the life of the mother, that they in fact are obligated to and have to do this and won't be put in prison or, you know, sued for doing it. So this is a really big case, because we've already seen where doctors have become more hesitant in states like Texas for really taking this step in order to save the life of a mother for fear of prosecution or losing your medical license, for example. So this is a bigger case for the actual surgical procedures of abortion.
So I guess, you know, as you think about it, just in the context of a presidential election year, Wendy, where do you think, are members of Congress, are they bringing this to the forefront, or they just don't want to get anywhere near this issue in what is an election year?
Well, Democrats want to basically advertise in most, but not all states, that they are the party that will try to protect access to reproductive health care, particularly in cases of rape, incest, life of the mother, but also that they are the party that will not come after contraception, for example. The Republican members of Congress, with some exceptions, want to really stay away from this issue. They really believe that this is the one issue that could cost them congressional races and the presidency, just based on what we saw in 2022 in response to the Dobbs decision. So Republicans want to stay away from it. They're hoping the court doesn't give the other side a lot of ammunition, and the Democrats are really going to hit home with this message, particularly in those two swing states that I mentioned, Arizona and Florida.
So considering that the case that we found out about today was a procedural issue, and that's why the vote went the way it went, what are going to be the two sides in the Idaho case?
Well, this is really, it will come back to the court's position that abortion is a state issue, that states have the right to regulate all conditions and access for abortion. That's pretty much what Dobbs did. And now Trump has reiterated that he believes it's up to the states. So if states want to criminalize giving a woman an abortion, even to save her life, I'm not sure the Supreme Court's going to step in and say, no. They've already, basically said it's up to the states. So I think that's the big question mark. And politically for the Republicans, this is a very difficult issue. If it in fact becomes the case that doctors are threatened with prison for saving the life of a woman, that affects women everywhere. It affects women and their daughters. It affects a lot of people in their daily life in terms of their reproductive health. People who are trying to get pregnant, people who have a complicated pregnancy. So it really gets to that core of voters that rejected the Republicans in 2022 on this issue and are very likely to do so again if it is the case that a state, can really prevent a doctor from saving a woman's life.
So are we going to end up, Wendy, with abortion policies that really are red and blue? Are we going to have that checkerboard in this country? Is that kind of how this thing may develop?
I mean, you can argue, Paul, that we already have that. And we certainly had a little bit of that before abortion was legalized in 1973 with the court decision. And we really, when you think about it, there are states where it's really almost virtually impossible to get an abortion. And certainly with a 6-week abortion ban, that becomes very difficult because a lot of women don't know they're pregnant by then. We really have a situation where there is a slight majority of states where abortion is still accessible. And then we have a great number of states, more than 20, where it's very difficult for a woman to get an abortion, and sometimes even in the case of rape, incest, or life of the mother. Now, Texas argues that's not their law, that people are misinterpreting it, that in fact, that doctors can perform this in Texas and not be penalized and not be criminalized. But the perception is out there that you can, in fact, bring this kind of charge, or even a civilian can bring a charge against you for it. So it's really deterring women's seeking of abortion in those states. Now, some other opponents will point out the fact that we actually had a slight increase in the overall number of abortions last year. And that's where access to this pill makes a huge difference for many women in America in terms of securing an abortion.
Interesting. Okay, that actually really helps to highlight that even though it may be difficult, that's why this pill became so important. Wendy, really amazing stuff. Definitely looking forward to having you back. Wendy Schiller, professor at Brown University there, standing by. But nonetheless, definitely sets the stage for the November election and sort of the policies that will come after that, which to me then begs the question, as an investor, bringing it back to our home base, what do you do about this?
Yeah.
And clearly investors are very worried about immigration. I mean, investors, voters everywhere.
Sure.
Very worried about immigration and very worried about fiscal policy. Like France has made that clear. The UK has made that clear. India made that clear. Mexico made that clear. What do we do with that now? If we look forward to the U.S. in November, because no one's going to be tackling fiscal policy.
No, I mean
the deficit. No way.
I mean deficits continue to run rampant. The national debt continues to balloon as a percentage of GDP, and but quite frankly, I've been around a while. This is always always been an issue, and no one has had the political or economic courage to try to tackle it. So I'm not sure what changes.
And it's always the whole, like, it matters when it matters and doesn't matter. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. All right, coming up, Ashley Fox, CEO and founder of Empify, will be joining us. For now, we go to Michael Barr with World and National News. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex. Paul, Charlie, the Supreme Court has preserved full access to mifepristone, as you've been talking about all morning. That's the pill used in more than half the abortions in this country. In a unanimous ruling, the justices overturned a federal appeals ruling that would have barred mail-order prescriptions for the drug. But Bloomberg's June Grasso says the justices did not weigh in on the FDA's looser restrictions around the pill.
Here they said that the doctors who challenged it and the groups who challenged it didn't have standing because they weren't hurt in any way. One way they put it is like, you know, have a dog in the fight.
Bloomberg law host June Grasso. The G7 summit has opened in Italy. Negotiators reached an agreement hours before the official opening of the summit on a U.S. proposal to back a $50 billion loan to Ukraine using frozen Russian assets as collateral. Growing support for Ukraine despite threats from Vladimir Putin over the U.S. green-lighting attacks on Russian targets near Ukraine's border. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin meeting with NATO defense ministers in Brussels this morning.
I'm grateful to Sweden for announcing its largest military assistance package yet, worth approximately $1.23 billion.
Secretary Austin announcing that along with Sweden, Spain, and Belgium are joining the U.S. in providing billions of dollars in additional military support for Ukraine. A big setback for Evan Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter being held in Russia. The prosecutor's office in Russia has announced Gershkovich will stand trial on espionage charges, a move which officially ends any future pre-detention appeals. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr. This is Bloomberg. Coming up, the U.S. Open Golf Update brought to you by Audi. Don't let anyone else drive off in the Audi model you've always wanted. Visit your local Audi dealer to get behind the wheel of yours today.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Little change on the S&P 500 index, just about unchanged now, lower by less than half a point. Rally in stocks fizzling as heightened political risk in France drives the premium on the nation's 10-year bonds toward the widest since 2017 over safer German peers. Again, the S&P, little change. We've got the Dow down 220 points, down 0.6%. NASDAQ building on yesterday's rally. The NASDAQ Composite Index up now by 0.3%. 10-year 4.25% with a 2-year yield 4.69%. Gold down 0.8%, holding above 2,300 the ounce, 23.07. West Texas Intermediate crude 78.24, lower today by just about 0.3%. Another welcome development this morning on the U.S. inflation front. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Producer prices posted the largest drop in 7 months in May. That aligns with a surprise slowdown in consumer prices and could boost spirits at the Federal Reserve. That said, wholesale gasoline costs accounted for more than half the decline in goods prices. Diesel, jet fuel, and electricity costs also declined last month. Energy prices, just like the actual products, tend to be volatile. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
JP Morgan Chase's asset management arm has raised more than $500 million for a biotech venture capital fund that will bet on the hottest corner of healthcare, weight loss drugs, among two of the biggest names in that part of the industry. Novo Nordisk down today by 1%, Eli Lilly up by 1%. Recapping, S&P now higher, barely up by 1 point. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. I'm Alex Steele alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We cover all the top news in business, finance, and economics through our lens of Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries around the world. And for the month of June, Bloomberg Radio is committed to bringing you segments and guests that focus on the topic of equality. And today, we're speaking with Ashley Fox, CEO and founder of Empify. Ashley, thanks for joining us in studio. You're based in Atlanta, Georgia, but you are a recovering Wall Streeter, so yes. New York is still kind of home for you.
Yes, yes.
What is Empify?
So Empify is the word empower and modify merged together. So I made the word up.
I like
we are a fintech startup that is revolutionizing how adults and children learn how to build wealth. So we create financial education tools and resources that target the 99% that Wall Street often overlooks. So we created programs in school systems and prison systems. We have a membership-based app where people from all over the world have access to financial education in the palm of their hand.
So what are you trying to address initially? Is it just the fact that you're trying to say, hey, this is how you invest? Or, I mean, what's kind of how do you get there?
So coming from a Wall Street background, we worked with ultra high net worth individuals. And so when you had at least $25 million, there's an infrastructure set up to help you protect your wealth, grow your wealth, and preserve your wealth. But what does that look like for the everyday person? Because you can't just walk into a bank and say, hey, can you teach me how to buy a stock? Can you teach me how to create a trust or build a legacy to pass down to my family? And I wanted to create something that gave that Wall Street experience, but for the everyday person. So we're teaching you the basics, getting your investment started, because there's a lot of fear, doubt, and worry, and I wanted to break that mental barrier to show people no matter how much money you do or do not have, where you come from or what you look like, you can build wealth, brick by brick, share by share, and so we want to make it in a culturally relevant, easy to understand way, so we've taught middle school students how to open brokerage accounts, how to buy stocks. We've been in the prison systems, teaching the everyday person a topic that we don't like to talk about at the dinner table, but it is something that can change our family's dynamics, definitely.
So first of all, my daughter will be in middle school in a year, so I love this program. I keep trying to teach her, if you spend that, you won't have that money later,
yes.
But it doesn't always sink in when she's 9.5. In terms of people who use your app to help generate wealth, what is their income base to begin with?
So when we think, our tech platform is a wealth builders community. So you can kind of look at that like the Netflix of finance, where we have over 250 hours of classes, tools, resources, covering from retirement planning, stock investing, parent investing, legacy planning, life insurance, and giving that holistic experience. So when people come in, I would say we have working professionals 25 to, one of our oldest members is 73 years old. So we typically target working professionals and entrepreneurs who have some income coming in, but are financially not educated, financially scared, not sure what to do, where to go, or who to trust. And we create that safe, community-like environment that teaches them the basics to, again, starting to open your brokerage account, understanding different types of stocks that are out there. How do you build your strategy so that you're growing your money, not just spending it, but you're preserving it and you're properly passing it down. So it's more of a holistic experience that targets the mind and hearts of people who want to invest, who want to learn how to build, just don't know where to go.
So what are, I'm trying to think of my kids, and I think some of the advice I've given them is max your 401k, you know, do that, pay your credit cards, don't let anything ride on your credit cards, pay it off. I mean, some of the basics. What are some of the basics that you start with your clients?
So one of the things that we do is take inventory of where you spend your money. Where are you shopping? Yes. What do you eat? What are you wearing? What gas do you pump? What kind of car do you drive? Because chances are a lot of the companies we use, know, and believe in are publicly traded. And we think that we need a lot of money to invest, but there are a lot of stocks that are under 300. We got trillion-dollar businesses that are less than $300 a share that we give more money to. And so the easiest way for us to do it is to start with what you know. Don't go research a random company you see on the internet. Start with who you are a loyal customer to, because it's a lot easier to read financials. It's a lot easier to understand a company, and start there, because the chances are if you're giving your money to these companies, there's a lot of people who are too. And so really getting it down to who are you, what do you use? What do you need? And let's start from there. So I always tell people, if you're going to use it and give your money to the company, why not consider owning a piece of that company? And you can do that by investing in the stock market.
You told us sort of why you came up with this idea. How long has it been around? What's it been like, the whole journey?
So I left Wall Street July 2013. I haven't looked back since. One of the craziest but most fulfilling experiences. I went on to be a financial advisor targeting low to moderate income individuals because I had a bunch of security licenses. And I realized that I didn't want to focus on the implementation. I wanted to give the education. And so that's where Amplify. So I came up with the word in 2013. We didn't generate our first stream of revenue until 2017. 2017, we got contracts with schools in Atlanta, Philadelphia, and in New York City. And then we went on to really massively produce education all throughout the country. COVID hit, and schools didn't know how to function. But the beauty of that was there were a lot of adults saying, I see what you're doing in school systems. What can you do for us? And I felt like God put me here not to just serve one individual as their advisor. I wanted to build what Kleenex is to tissues is what Amplify will be for finance. And that's what I wanted to create. So in 2020, we launched our Wealth Builders Community Platform, which is the tech platform that allows adults in over 44 different countries, thousands of people, to get access to the tools and resources. It's been a journey.
So that came second,
yes,
to the educational part to schools and prisons.
Correct. So first we were B2B, and then when COVID hit, we became B2C, but we were able to scale a lot faster because we had technology. And so I would say journey-wise, it's been fulfilling because we've impacted the lives of millions of people. We've partnered with community college, financial institutions, companies that I used to work for or research we're aligning ourselves to these organizations to be able to create financial education resources for the everyday person. So I can say as an entrepreneur, it's been a journey. I started out with something I wanted to give the world. I didn't know how. I did not know what I was going to do, but I knew why, and I knew I wanted to be the woman to get it done. And I think I'm able to translate Wall Street knowledge because I understand how the banking system, how Wall Street works. But I also didn't come from growing up with a lot of money. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from college. I was making more money than both my parents when I was early on Wall Street. And I wanted to be able to take that universal language and create something that can make people believe no matter what you look like, you can build wealth. And no matter what you do or do not know, Amplify is here to give you that education.
How many employees do you have in your company, and how's that grown?
So right now we are a team of 8. We're actually in the process of hiring 3 more individuals, so we will be in double digits. I think that's been the most challenging part, the people part. They don't teach you that in school.
Like finding the right people?
Finding the right people, building the culture, having just the resources, the environment. I think everyone on our team is phenomenal because they believe in what we do. And I think I never left Wall Street to make money. I think I would have stayed there if I wanted to make the money. I really wanted to change the dynamic, because you shouldn't have to go to Wall Street to get access to this information. How can we put it in our school systems? How can we talk about it at the dinner table during holidays? And so we are right now a team of 8. I would say in the next 30 days, we'll probably be a team of 12 people. But we are growing fast as a company. It's been an exciting journey.
Amazing. This was such a great story. Thank you so much for bringing it for us. I had 0 financial education until I started working in this industry, and I had to claw my way up. So I'm so appreciative of what you guys are doing. Thank you so much. Ashley Fox, CEO and founder of Amplify, on her fintech startup, regular old people. Build wealth, figure stuff out. Really amazing stuff. Let's get check in here on where we are within the markets. A whole lot of nothing. It looks like European equity is really leading the decline here for U.S. The Dow Jones down by 0.5%. The Nasdaq still hold on to gains.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
I'm Charlie Pellet. Broadcom, a chip supplier for Apple and other big tech companies, seeing its biggest surge in 4 years after its latest results did top estimates lifted by robust demand for artificial intelligence products. Shares of Broadcom, AVGO on the ticker, up now by 13.1%. Sales in the full fiscal year, which runs through October, will be about $51 billion. Analysts had projected $50.6 billion. Company also following NVIDIA among big tech names and announcing a 10-for-1 stock split. Adobe among the names reporting today after the close of trading. Jefferies says Adobe is expected to report quarterly sales in line with consensus as lukewarm economic conditions continue to constrain its customers' technology budgets. Adobe shares ahead of earnings, down by 0.4%. Tesla CEO Elon Musk says 2 key shareholder votes are passing by a wide margin, one to reaffirm his $56 billion pay package, and the other to move the electric vehicle maker's corporate home to Texas. Musk posted that on X before today's Tesla shareholder meeting got underway in Austin, Texas. Tesla shares, they're up now by 3.9%. Some of the other stories we're following: Alphabet's Google has partnered with a Nevada utility and a geothermal energy startup to run data centers on electricity derived from the Earth's own heat. Startup Fervo Energy will develop a geothermal power plant supplying 115 megawatts of electricity to Envy Energy, that is a subsidiary of Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway Energy. Those are our top company stories at this hour, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
Happy Thursday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele, alongside Paul Sweeney. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We cover all the news that you need to know, business, economics, and finance with our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries around the world. We also keep you updated on world and national news with Michael Barr. Michael?
Thank you very much, Alex, Paul, and Charlie. The Supreme Court has ruled to uphold full access to the abortion pill mifepristone. Bloomberg's Amy Morris reports from Washington.
The justices preserved full access to a widely used abortion pill in a case that carries major stakes for reproductive rights and election year politics. The court unanimously overturned a federal appeals ruling that would have barred mail-order prescriptions for mifepristone, the drug now used in more than half of U.S. abortions. The lower court ruling would have reduced abortion access even in states where reproductive rights have broad support. The majority on the court said the anti-abortion doctors and organizations that sued lacked legal standing because they're not directly affected by the FDA's actions. In Washington, Amy Morris, Bloomberg Radio.
The G7 nations have agreed on a loan to provide Ukraine with about $50 billion in new aid by the end of the year. Bloomberg's Oliver Crook has more from the summit in Italy.
The form that this will take is multiple loans done sort of bilaterally between each of the G7 countries. The EU will be its own bloc, and each of these loans will be then given to Ukraine. And this is the key detail here. The question was, how much will everyone contribute? It's going to be proportional to the size of the economy.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook says the final technical details will be ironed out after the summit. Russia says it will put on trial a Wall Street Journal reporter it detained months ago. Russian prosecutors accuse Evan Gershkovich of working for the CIA. They say Gershkovich collected information about a Russian tank factory. He has been detained since he was arrested in March of last year. He denies the espionage charges. Round one of the U.S. Open at Pinehurst is underway. Matthew Pavin leads at 4 under after 12. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Alex, Charlie.
All right, thank you so much, Michael Barr. So the one thing we didn't talk about all morning, as we're kind of drumbeating to, is Tesla's shareholder vote. So it looks like there are signs that Tesla's shareholders will be approving a $56 billion pay package for Elon Musk, and that's really given a stock a boost as well. Yeah, there are broader challenges, etc. But Dan Ives over at Wedbush was saying this could remove a $20–25 overhang on the stock. And this goes to a pay package that were tied to milestones within the stock price as well as in the company, and he would get options for that at different prices at the low price, and that's what the pay package is after the Delaware court said, nah, we don't like it, and now they're trying to move to Texas too to kind of get around that.
Yeah, so I guess, from Wall Street's perspective, keeping him there would remove a big risk that analysts and investors have been wary of, and that is Musk's threat to take his artificial intelligence ideas elsewhere upon a rejection of his pay plan. That would have spelled disaster for a stock whose pricey valuation depends on an AI story that falls flat without its CIO. So you talk about key man risk or key person risk. Boy, it's certainly prevalent, maybe with no company more so than with Tesla. It's a monster number. I have no opinion on the number, and I kind of think about paying athletes, paying executives. It's whatever the market will bear, is my personal opinion. And if the market says, yeah, we're okay with $56 billion, given the value that he's created for us, then have at it.
Also, it already happened. This is a pay package from before. That's what's so odd about it. So we were talking to Jim Chanos yesterday on TV, and he's like, look, you already gave him the package, so just approve it. But he did make the point that the way it was structured was the weird part, and he doesn't like the way it's structured, meaning that each milestone that you hit, he got the stock at the price where the package was originally issued.
Yep.
And his point was that it gives him a call option on the stock and a put option on the stock. Maybe that is not the best way to structure the deal, but like, dude, you already said it, so
Right.
dude, approve it.
Exactly.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, and it's I'm just got a great chart in the Bloomberg article here, just showing Tesla is the most expensive mega cap stock by a long shot. When you look at price to earnings ratio. So the market certainly puts a huge value on Mr. Musk and what they're doing over there at Tesla. So that'll do it for Alex and me today. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C. That starts right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The Supreme Court upholds access to the abortion pill as Donald Trump returns to Washington in a split screen with Joe Biden at the G7 in Italy. Welcome to the fastest show in politics on an important day here in the Capitol with reporting and insights ahead from the best of Bloomberg. Kaylee Lyons joins live from Capitol Hill. Laura Davison with me here in Washington and June Grasso in New York as we step through each story that's breaking before our eyes today with analysis from our political panel. Bloomberg Politics contributor Rick Davis is with us today alongside Brad Howard from Corcoran Street Group. So let's get started, as always, with a look at Wall Street. For that, we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Joe Matthew. Day after the Fed meeting, we're looking at a mixed market right now. We got the S&P swinging between gains and losses, back in the red right now, looking at a 6-point drop, down by about 0.1%. Dow Industrials down 280, a decline there of 0.7%. NASDAQ building on yesterday's record, up another 0.1%, higher by 23 points. Treasury yields fell as a cool down in another key measure of inflation this morning reinforced the case for the Federal Reserve to cut rates this year. 10-year 4.25%, 2-year 4.68%. Spot gold down 1.2%, $22.96 the ounce, below 2,300. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.3%, $78.25 a barrel. A day after the Fed meeting, investors are digesting yesterday's Fed statement and Chair Jay Powell's news conference. Gargi Chaudhry is head of iShares investment strategy at BlackRock Financial Management, and she was a guest this morning on Bloomberg Surveillance.
So yesterday was a fun day. I think hearing from Chair Powell, seeing the one dot was a little bit of a surprise, given that the data hasn't meaningfully shifted in a hawkish direction since we last heard from them. So to see 3 dots in the April meeting and 1 in the June meeting was very surprising.
BlackRock's Gargi Chaudhry, and again, 10-year 4.24%. U.S. Supreme Court siding with Starbucks over the National Labor Relations Board in a decision that will make it more difficult for the agency to win temporary reinstatement of workers fired during labor disputes. Starbucks shares, they're up right now by 0.8%. Recapping stocks mixed, S&P lower by 0.1%. Balance of Power continues right now in Washington. Back we go once again. Your host, here he is. We're glad to have him, Joe Matthew.
Charlie Pellet, glad to have you, sir. And we'll get back to Charlie for a look at the markets as we focus on politics here for the next 2 hours on Balance of Power here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. It's great to have you with us as we follow a couple of parallel storylines today that are developing in Washington. And you know how this goes. Everything intersects as we consider life and politics in a campaign season. Things really kicked up this morning at 10 o'clock when we got this ruling from the Supreme Court. This is the ruling no one had their eyes on today, right? Because everybody was following Donald Trump on his big return to Capitol Hill. These two unfolding in Washington as Joe Biden continues at the G7 in Italy. So we're spinning some plates here. Maybe it's a triple split screen, if you will. The Supreme Court preserving full access to mifepristone. This is the abortion pill we've talked so much about. Overturning, by the way, unanimously overturning this federal appeals court ruling that would have barred mail order prescriptions for mifepristone. Okay, so we got that done. Just as Donald Trump is talking to Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Kayleigh Lines was on the Hill earlier. You can't keep her in the studio today. She's followed Donald Trump now from Capitol Hill at those meetings where protesters were out, you better believe, very early this morning. Kayleigh's made her way down to the Wharf in Southwest Washington, which is home to the Business Roundtable. That's where Donald Trump makes the next stop here, addressing some 90 CEOs in the room, some bold faces, Jamie Dimon, Tim Cook among them, before he holds a news conference later on. That could, by the way, collide with Joe Biden's news conference in Italy. So keep your split screen handy. We're going to do this together right now. Kayleigh joins us from the Wharf following each movement of the former president. Kayleigh, how's it going so far?
Well, right now at the Wharf, Joe, it is quiet. Donald Trump is inside speaking with a number of CEOs, including the likes of Jamie Dimon, of Jane Fraser. We also expect that Apple CEO Tim Cook is inside receiving this message from Donald Trump, who, of course, is in attendance in person, unlike Joe Biden, who is at the G7. So the White House Chief of Staff, Jeff Zients, had to speak on Biden's behalf to this business group earlier this morning. But, of course, this Business Roundtable, Joe, is a pro-corporate friendly policy kind of group. So that is likely the ideas that Donald Trump is circulating in the rooms inside, the idea of lower tax rates, not just for corporations, but others across the country, of easing regulation. And we understand that was similar to what he said in his meeting with House Republicans at the Capitol Hill Club earlier today. I spoke with a number of them on their way out of that meeting who not only said that it was a very celebratory kind of atmosphere, not just because the former president's birthday is tomorrow, but also because they feel strongly about the prospects of his winning in 2024. But he said they said that he was outlining specific economic policy, including ideas of raising tariffs in order to potentially partially pay for lower income taxes on Americans. That was one of the policy ideas that lawmakers described to me he floated during that meeting. So it'll be interesting to see if CEOs coming out of this meeting confirm that, Joe.
Well, it's fascinating, Kayleigh. Thank you for the play-by-play here. This all happening as the Supreme Court rules today, and what I think we could argue might be the best news of the day for Donald Trump here, who now doesn't have to answer to potentially a different ruling here in which the Supreme Court could have barred access to mifepristone. Is that being discussed? Is Donald Trump getting into this today?
Well, the news crossed once Donald Trump was already inside the Capitol Hill with Republicans, so it's not clear whether or not he actually knew about the mifepristone ruling as he was speaking with lawmakers, Joe. But what lawmakers said coming out of the meeting is that he did indeed address abortion, specifically this platform he seems to have adopted, which is, I supported the Dobbs decision. I put the justices on the court who allowed that to happen. But from here, everything needs to be left up to the states. It was interesting to see Congresswoman Nancy Mace of South Carolina, who just actually won her primary earlier this week, in part due to the endorsement of Donald Trump, came out of that meeting and said to the reporters that were gathered, I loved what he said about abortion. So it was certainly a topic that was raised in addition to the number of economic policies that he talked about. But Joe, you're absolutely right. Republicans are also very aware of how delicate this issue is for them as they campaign for re-election, and it could have potentially been a much larger headache had mifepristone access not been upheld by the high court, as we all saw the galvanizing force the Dobbs ruling had on the midterms in 2024, and Republicans certainly fear that prospect of that happening again come November.
All right, Kayleigh, great reporting, and thank you for being out there for us. We'll get back with Kayleigh once the horde emerges from this meeting. Again, 90 CEOs, Business Roundtable, hearing from both campaigns, but in the case of the Republican nominee, presumptive nominee, they're hearing from Donald Trump directly. Jeff Zients, the Chief of Staff, speaking on behalf of Joe Biden, as Kayleigh mentioned, and we'll see if Kayleigh can hear from some of those CEOs in the room. We're going to bring you about 90 minutes from now a news conference that Donald Trump has planned from here in Washington following these meetings today. But we want to circle back to the Supreme Court ruling and an important conversation to put a finer point on what we've learned today. June Grasso is joining us live from New York, of course, the host of Bloomberg Law. Oh, my goodness, we just need to give a daily slot here because you can't separate the politics from the legal world these days. This is a big one, June. I'm sure you had allowed for this to happen today. It did surprise some people in Washington who thought they might wait till the final day for some of the larger rulings. Are you surprised, though, that this was unanimous?
I am surprised that it was unanimous. I'm not surprised that the decision is what it is, because basically what the justices did is take an off-ramp and say this group that's bringing this group of conservative Christian doctors doesn't have standing because they have nothing that's being injured here, is the basic thing. It's sort of called, you have a dog in the fight. But so it might have not been unanimous, but after the oral arguments, it was pretty clear that they would go off on the standing point. They did not rule about whether or not the FDA was correct in loosening the restrictions for mifepristone. And I have to say that though this is great news, in the final paragraph of Justice Kavanaugh's opinion, he said, it's not clear that no one else would have standing to challenge the FDA and the relaxed rulings of on mifepristone. And we know that there are other groups waiting to challenge it. So this is not the end.
Well, that's really important, June. Just to make sure we all understand this, the court stopped short of affirming the FDA's decisions to loosen restrictions. So do we frame this as a mixed ruling? Because at the same time, they're upholding access, at least as it stood before.
You know, I think that most people will look at this and say, you know, it's a positive ruling. You do have now, you don't have a threat right now of mifepristone not being able to be mailed out across the country. So that is, it's a victory, and often they go off on tangents. But I mean, that's why they were able to come to a unanimous opinion, because it was such a narrow procedural off-ramp, and, you know, doesn't say anything about, and in fact, Brett Kavanaugh, who I'll just remind you, Joe, was the one who wrote the concurring opinion in the Dobbs case, saying, well, we're done with abortion now, it's up to the states. Well, here he is writing the opinion here in this case, and there's another abortion case that's more iffy yet to come.
Yeah. Of course, we've got the big one on presidential immunity that may or may not pave the way for a January 6th trial for Donald Trump here in Washington. Do you still expect that comes at the last minute?
I do, and I was talking to Greg Storr, our Supreme Court reporter, about this yesterday, and you know, we sort of agree that that's a case where there are probably going to be a lot of concurring and dissenting opinions. And when you think about it, you heard a couple of weeks ago Justice Sotomayor saying that after some of these opinions are announced, she goes back to her chambers, closes the door, and cries, and that more of that is to come. So we think that it probably will be toward the end, but you know, you can't tell. And look at it. The biggest cases, besides abortion, the biggest cases are still yet to come in the 2 weeks left in the term. So, you know, whether it comes next week or the week after, it will hit with a thud, I'm sure.
There's no days off for June Grasso, boy, the host of Bloomberg Law. We'll be listening later, June. 6 p.m. Washington time here on Bloomberg Radio, on the satellite, and on YouTube. This is Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We've heard from Kayleigh on the wharf following her visit to Capitol Hill earlier, following Donald Trump. Business Roundtable, his return to the Capitol, in Capitol Hill more specifically for the first time since January 6th. And June Grasso, the host of Bloomberg Law. Now, helping us stitch all this together is the maestro. Laura Davison is with us, Bloomberg Politics editor. It's her job to see the bigger picture here. Laura, it's great to see you. All of this happening concurrently in Washington against a split screen of a Joe Biden at the G7. The campaign implications here are huge, but can we quantify them?
It's really hard to say right now, but it is a fascinating split screen. You know, just down the street from the Supreme Court, Trump is going to roll up to meet with senators here in just a couple minutes. You know, this morning he was, you know, across the Capitol Hill complex meeting with House Republicans, where he kind of, you know, did a show of his greatest hits. Yeah. Talked about his legal woes, talked about the witch hunt, but also interestingly talked about tariffs and taxes specifically, and how he wants to raise tariffs to offset more tax cuts. So this is, you know, kind of a Republican Party you already see, and this is an idea, by the way, if you would have brought this up to Republicans, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, total anathema. And now this is, you know, got applause in the room. This is part of the platform. This is what people want. So, you know, this is, you know, if Trump wins and Republicans control Congress, that is, you know, kind of item number one, expect to see.
Some wild stories from inside the room. They sang him happy birthdays. Birthday's tomorrow, right? 78 years old, reminding us that age is an issue in this campaign, at least for some. They presented him with the game-winning ball from the congressional baseball game last night, which Republicans won handily. But was the greatest gift from the Supreme Court today?
You know, this is.
Am I looking at that right?
I mean, I think this is going to be a tricky one, especially, people, mifepristone.
Yeah.
One, it's hard for
Well
me to
done.
say even.
Absolutely.
But it's one that people have had more trouble wrapping their head around on what this drug is.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, he was threatening to put restrictions on contraception. He had to walk that back. And Donald Trump has repeatedly said, even, turning down Roe in 2022 was something that will make politically great issues, great problems for the Republican Party when it comes to suburban women. Now he doesn't have to answer to another ruling.
Yes,
on abortion.
this is helpful. And he even said in an interview just a couple weeks ago with Tucker Carlson, with Fox News, by the way, that he thinks that Republicans don't know how to talk about abortion.
That's right.
And so this is something that is really, he is clearly pointed out as a messaging problem within his own party. And Trump wants to be able to say, look, either the courts have decided or the states are going to decide that this isn't something for me, my campaign, to come up with policy for.
So fascinating. In this case, then, Joe Biden is watching it from across the ocean. We're going to have potentially dueling news conferences in our next hour to truly animate the split screen. It's literal in this case. Does he speak to this today, even though he's at the G7 with Volodymyr Zelensky?
Well, he'll be getting questions, so he certainly could.
It's coming up.
Coming up, of course, we also haven't heard him speak on Hunter Biden yet either. Of course, there'll be news. The big news out of the G7 was, kind of this additional aid for Ukraine. So, I anticipate that will be the top issue. But, all these sort of political issues swirling at home are definitely front and center.
So you'll have, I think 2 and 2 is typically how this goes. 2 domestic reporters, 2 from foreign press. The domestic reporters are going to be asking about everything except the G7 then. They want to hear about Hunter. They want to hear about mifepristone.
Yes, those could be the questions. Of course.
White House will love that.
They will, certainly not. Though we can anticipate that the Ukrainian press will certainly ask.
This will be discussed. And it's important news, by the way. I don't know to what extent we're going to be having this as part of our broadcast, but they're both scheduled for about 1:30 and 1:45, Trump, then Biden. What's Donald Trump doing today? He framed the last one as a news conference, didn't take one question from a reporter.
This one was initially billed as a press conference and has since been billed as remarks.
Is that right? So no
I
questions.
anticipate this could be much like the one he did at Trump Tower the day after the conviction, where he comes in, he gives a speech, probably a lot of the greatest hits. He might give us a little sense of what he talked about. Trump is famous for sort of speaking about what has been most recently been on his mind. So these meetings with CEOs, we'll see what he said into this room he had some CEOs there who are fans, some that are not so much, that made it very clear. They said, yes, I'm attending, but that's because I'm a member of Business Roundtable, or, I was already scheduled to be there. They were,
Mitt Romney just couldn't make it. He had to fly out of town. It's just the way
his flight was canceled, and he will now be there.
Is that true?
He was actually, interesting enough, headed to Palm Beach, so he could just get a ride on Trump Force One back with Trump after the meeting.
A great update. Donald Trump says to House Republicans, quote, Milwaukee, where we're having our convention, is a horrible city, unquote. Are Democrats making the T-shirts already?
Well, this is super interesting because you have the Milwaukee mayor, who Stephanie Lai, a politics reporter on our team, spoke with yesterday, who is actually gung-ho about the Republican convention being in their city. And they're, doing all sorts of prep work. And they said, look, I don't care about red or blue. All I care is about green, a.k.a. the economic activity that's coming into the city. So this may be a little shrug off their shoulders. I will note that the DNC did have a statement out, immediately after this comment.
You're going to be in Milwaukee, right?
I will be.
You'll be with us every day, is what I'm telling you right now, if you don't know that already. That's Laura Davison, Bloomberg Politics editor on a very important day here in Washington. Thank you so much, Laura. As I said, the maestro, she'll be weaving all of these together into the stories that you'll be reading on the terminal and online throughout the day. It's the fastest show in politics and a lot more ahead. Our panel in place, Rick Davis and Brad Howard coming up, and we'll keep our eyes on Donald Trump's movements around town. This is Bloomberg.